Welcome to our fourth episode on the book of Ruth. On her two daughters-in-law, the Moabite girls Orpah and Ruth. It happens this way in the text. First, the sons are named as Mahlon and Chilion. And then the two wives are named as Orpah and Ruth. If we had only those verses, no one would object to the idea that Orpah was married to Mahlon and Ruth was married to Chilion. Toward the end of the book, however, it says that Ruth was the wife of Mahlon, which throws this earlier introduction at the beginning of the book into doubt. Was this a false clue that the author of the book of Ruth put into the text to throw us off the scent the way Agatha Christie does in her novels? I don't believe that. This is a very well-organized narrator. It was his duty as a narrator to communicate to us that Mahlon was the elder son by putting his name first and honoring the seniority. But there is seniority among the wives, just as there is among the husbands. And by listing Orpah first, the narrator does more than suggest that Orpah is the wife of Mahlon. He asserts it. Well, how can he assert it in chapter 1 and deny it in chapter 4? And the answer is quite simple, although it seems to have escaped most people. Remember last time I said that the two brothers did not die simultaneously. One died before the other. And so I suggested that the narrator indicated that Chilion died before his older brother Mahlon. At that point, his estate passed to his older brother, and his wife went with it, along with her dowry. When Chilion died, Ruth, who was the true wife of Chilion in chapter 1, becomes the legal wife of Mahlon in chapter 4. So I guess I am suggesting that Ruth had 3 husbands in the course of the book. She was the full wife to Chilion. As his widow, she became the legal wife of her brother-in-law Mahlon, and after his death, she contracted marriage with Boaz in order to raise up a child to Mahlon, because that was where her obligation lay at that point. Ruth is a complex individual. There's a lot going on in the story here. What about Orpah? Naomi blesses both of her daughter-in-laws with my favorite quotation in the entire book. I know everyone loves, "Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God," from the mouth of Ruth. But I really love this sentence from Naomi. She says to her daughters-in-law, "May the Lord be kind to you as you were to the departed and to me." She thanks both daughters-in-law equally. Like a good mother, she does not play favorites between her sons, and she does not play favorites between her sons' wives. It can only cause trouble in a family when a parent plays favorites with children and their spouses. But she's not talking out of one side of her mouth toward Ruth and another side of her mouth toward Orpah. She's not sincere in praising Ruth and insincere in praising Orpah. These two women are not antitypes. They're not opposing models. Take, for example, Martha and Mary in the gospel. One is taken as the symbol of contemplative life because she sits down with Jesus and to converse, and the other is taken as the model of the active life because she's doing the work of the home. They were two sisters, but they had two styles of operating, two different personalities, and they're held up in the gospel as models of the two ways, the contemplative way and the active way. Both valid ways, but one is the better way. Here, we do not have Orpah and Ruth set up as countertypes in this way. They are both faithful wives to the sons of Naomi. They both treat Naomi's boys well. Nothing captures the love of a mother's heart more than seeing her boys well settled in matrimony. They served those two boys until their dying breath, probably nursing them in their final moments of agony with the plague. And Naomi knows that her two daughters-in-law have been saints, and she pronounces the blessing of God equally upon them both. Sarah Moline suggested the possibility that Orpah and Ruth were actually sisters. When Naomi tells them to go back to their mother, she uses the singular mother and not the plural mothers. So the text at least leaves open the distinct possibility that Orpah and Ruth were sisters. And it was not uncommon in rural places, even into the 20th century, for people to have very limited social exposure and for brothers to marry sisters. And if I'm correct in my assessment that Elimelech brought his family to the farm of a Moabite man who had only daughters, Elimelech himself had been setting up this arrangement of the two sons marrying two daughters of another family. Be that as it may, the closeness between Orpah and Ruth is sister-like. They are sisters-in-law, and it may very well, they act not only like they are sisters, they act like they are twins, like they are identical twins, almost like they are Siamese twins. Orpah leaves the story without ever having pronounced a single word. But at that point, Ruth had not pronounced a distinct word either. We know what happens to Ruth then, because the story concentrates on her from that point onwards. But let's speculate for a moment what happened to Orpah after she left the scene. She went back to the house of her mother. It doesn't say the house of her mother and her father. It is quite possible that Orpah's father had died in the plague, just as all the other men had in the story. So Orpah had the job of caring for her mother, just as Ruth took on the care of Naomi. They were both able-bodied young women, able to do farm work, and both of them probably did that, one in one country and one in another. They must have been raised as farm girls because they know what to do during the harvest. And so Orpah cared for her mother until her mother was able to find a second husband for her. This might not have been too difficult because Orpah was able to bring back into the family the dowry that she had taken into her first marriage. And that was probably the larger of the two dowries. Orpah's dowry, marrying not just the heir of a landowner, but someone who had recently become a landowner by the death of his father, would have brought a larger dowry in than Ruth, who was marrying the younger son of a landowner and who didn't have the same expectations for her children that Orpah would have had for hers. So Orpah brought her sizable dowry as well as her hardworking lifestyle back to care for her mother and would have been able to find a decent husband on the rebound after the death of Mahlon, her first husband. The children of Orpah, 100% Moabite, would have been first cousins of the children of Ruth. The grandsons of Orpah would have been second cousins of the grandsons of Ruth. The great-grandsons of Orpah would have been the third cousins of the great-grandsons of Ruth. And so these two women, by separating, expanded the sides of the family in two directions. The women wept when they were separated from each other, but they helped to bring two countries together, so that because of Orpah and Ruth, there never was a war between the kingdom of Jerusalem and the kingdom of Moab. There were wars between Moab and the northern kingdom that was not under the house of David. There were even wars and skirmishes with Benjamin, very close to Judea. But never was a drop of blood shed between the homeland of Ruth and Orpah and the Judeans. And that is an accomplishment for two countries that stand side by side in the Middle East, don't you think? The love between those two, maybe they were sisters, certainly they were sisters-in-law, became the love between two nations. Orpah and Ruth were peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. We'll see you next time.